Hi everyone, my name is Karis. Welcome back to my corner of the internet where I talk about books and other things that I enjoy. And today I'm going to be talking about my favourite books of the year. Also, I know that I've disappeared again for several weeks after saying that I was coming back to YouTube. I'm hoping that I can be more consistent in 2022, and I'm hoping that doing this video at the end of the year is going to ease me back into it gently. That being said, I will just get on with going through the 10 things that I want to talk about today. So I've read at the moment 48 books in 2021. I've got a couple of days left of the year and I'm really hoping that I can get to 50. I know the goal is just an arbitrary number, but I will feel such success within myself if I achieve it. So I'm hoping that I will, but I thought that I probably am not going to read another favourite within the last 2 books that I read, because I'm just going to be picking up like quick and easy things and nothing that I really am predicting to be a 5-star. So I thought it would be a pretty safe time to talk about my 10 favourite things of the year. Of the 48 books that I've read, I've enjoyed a lot of them, but looking back at my list, there aren't as many as I thought that really stood out to me. And I think it's because 2021 I read a lot outside of my comfort zone. I said a few times at the start of the year that I had quite a few years off from reading consistently. And when I was reading before, I was reading predominantly YA contemporary, and that just isn't the sort of thing that I want to be reading all the time anymore. So this year I was really trying to experiment with lots of different sorts of books and really find my tastes and authors and genres, all that sort of thing that I enjoy. So I would say, thinking back on the whole, I have had a lot of sort of middle of the road books. I've had a few disappointments, but I have had some really good standout ones as well. These are in a rough sort of order. The top 5 are definitely my top 5 books of the year. The others aren't really ranked that much because I couldn't really do it. Also, I've given up completely with star ratings at this point in the year. I just find it so arbitrary and a bit pointless because I rate different types of books very differently. So I may have given these star ratings at some point in the year, and I may have said that they were like 4 stars and some other books were 5 stars and they haven't made it onto the list. I would actually consider books to be favourites if they have staying power. So yeah, basically the list hasn't really been chosen on ratings, it's been picked on vibes. That being said, the first book that I wanted to talk about was The Emperor's Babe by Bernardine Evaristo. I think I read this back in March or April after getting it in a Books That Matter subscription box back when I was getting those subscription boxes, and I remember being really glad that I'd got it in that box because I don't think I'd have picked this up of my own accord because I hadn't actually heard of this. I've of course heard of Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, but I hadn't done much research into her backlist. This is one that came out I think in the early 2000s, and it's basically set in Roman London, and it follows the story of a main character who is sold by her family as a child bride when she's a really young preteen slash child. I think she's about 11 at the start of this book, and it follows her life story basically and all the things that happen to her, and it's told in verse, so I managed to get through it really quickly. And the thing that I really loved about this was how sort of transcendent it was. So although it's set in Roman Britain and that setting is conjured really well, that was another thing that I loved. I felt like I was really there with like the sights and the smells. With the descriptions of this book did that perfectly, but at the same time it's very recognisable to a modern day audience as well, both in terms of like geography. So it's set in London and you can recognise some of the locations as where they are in London today, but also like a lot of the topics I found that it was just making a really good commentary on the present day or the early 2000s when this was written, but it was still very relevant to today as well. I remember saying after reading this that I'd love to try some more Bernardine Evaristo, and I haven't got around to it yet, but I would really like to in 2022. I do have Girl, Woman, Other now, so that will probably be the next one that I read, although I would really like to try another of her books in verse. If she has any, I'm assuming she does, because I really liked the way that that format was used in this book, and I don't often read books in verse, but I do tend to really enjoy them when I do. Which does lead me on really nicely in a little segue to the next book on my list, which is The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. This is just snuck in there because I read this one in December. I picked this one up at work from the Pride Network, so I made sure to grab it because I've heard loads of really good things about this in the past, and it definitely didn't disappoint. I really enjoyed it as well. So this follows our main character called Michael, and going into it I just thought it was a book about him wanting to be a drag queen, but there is so much more to it than that. Drag does feature in the later sections of this book when Michael goes off to university, but it's really a story about his identity and all the different layers of that. So there's his identity as a drag queen and his expression of gender and what that means to him. There's also his identity as a gay man. He comes out quite early on in this book, and you see the way that different characters react to that and him navigating his life as a black gay man. There's also his racial identity. So his dad is Jamaican, his mom is Greek Cypriot, but he was born in Britain, and the book sort of discusses all the different facets of that identity as well, and then all these different layers of his identity coming together. There's also some discussions of things like internalized homophobia, all different sorts of things that I thought came together really well. As with The Emperor's Babe, I thought the verse format worked really well in this book. Although it was used quite differently, I felt that it really helped to convey Michael's voice. You also see him discovering his love for poetry and writing poetry throughout the book. He also takes part in like a spoken word night, and his drag piece largely involves spoken word as well, so it was really cool to see how that sort of wove in to the general format of this book. I've heard some really good things about the audio version of this, and I would really like to in the future try and give that a listen as well, because I think that would just add an extra element to this to hear it read out as it was sort of intended to be heard. The next book on my list is Cat's Eye by Margaret Atwood. I read this back in April, I think, and this was, I want to say, the first book possibly for Anna and Bee's Briar Rose book club, which I have taken part in a few times, not for a few months actually, but it's always really fun to join in with the books that they're reading and hear what they have to think about them. I will leave a link to their discussion for this book in the description, because from what I remember they had very similar thoughts to me, and the way that they do their discussions with like a PowerPoint presentation and stuff is just really good. So I definitely go ahead and watch that if you want to know more in depth about this book. But basically this follows the story of a woman who is in her 40s, I want to say. It doesn't say on the back, but I want to say in her 40s, and she goes back to the place where she grew up for an art exhibition because she's an artist, and being back there brings back all these memories of her childhood. And the real centre of the story is this sort of intense relationship between her and another girl called Cordelia, who was her best friend but also her worst enemy at the same time. I really love books that have any sort of friendship at the centre of them, and also books about like adolescence and growing up, especially when it comes to teenage girls. So as soon as I heard the premise of this, I knew that it was one that I really wanted to read, and I mean, it's on this list, so as you can tell, I'm really glad that I did. I do remember liking the first half of this book a lot more, because that was the section that was more focused on the main character's childhood and meeting these friends for the first time. I did like the overall story as well. The other thing that I remember is Cordelia, who is like the best friend and the bully. She was definitely the most intriguing character for me, and I really liked the way that although she was sort of like the antagonist in the eyes of the main character, as the reader you could tell that it wasn't as straightforward as that. The main character had her flaws as well. You came to understand a lot about Cordelia as you read through it, and I really liked that sort of layered and more complex view of friendship. It is quite a long book, but I did persevere through it, and I'm really glad that I did, and I would love to read more Atwood in the future. I've read The Handmaid's Tale but nothing else, so I think I'm definitely gonna try some more of her stuff. I do have a couple of her other books. I can't remember what they are off the top of my head, but I have bought some since reading this, so maybe 2022, hopefully, I'll get round to at least one more. Next here I have Promising Young Women by Caroline O'Donoghue. I think I read this back in April sort of time as well. This book is about a woman in her early 20s. I can't remember her exact age, but early to mid 20s, and it's set in like an office in London, and she basically begins this relationship with her boss, who is several years older than her, and he's also married, and it follows the way that that impacts her life, her work, her friendships, all her other relationships. I thought it was a really fascinating and really well done commentary on all of these topics. The bit on the back of this says it manages to capture exactly how it feels to be a 20-something woman in London while also containing a gleefully dark and gothic streak, and I would definitely agree with that. This is exactly the sort of book that I want to read more of. That whole sense of having left university now, being independent for the first time, and being in your early mid-20s, being in London or other cities or wherever, going into the world of work for the first time, and navigating that. I find that whole premise so fascinating, and obviously the added sort of relationship element to this that's at the core of the story made it even more interesting. I think even though I couldn't relate to that exact situation, there were elements of it that I found relatable, certain toxicities I guess that were discussed that I was like, yeah, I felt like that before. I'm definitely going to be reading some more Caroline O'Donoghue in the near future. I had got one of her other books on my list of things that I wanted to read before the end of the year. That's not going to happen now because I didn't bring it back to my parents with me, but hopefully in early 2022, because I loved her writing style as well, and I think she's going to be a new all-time favourite author for me when I've read the rest of her current books that she has out. Speaking of favourite authors, next I'm quickly going to mention the Heartstopper series by Alice Oseman. I did a full vlog where I read all of these. The first 3 were rereads for me, and then the 4th volume came out this year and I read this one for the first time, and I just had such a fun time rereading and reading them. So I will leave a link to that in the description and the cards if you want to see my reactions to them as I was reading them, because they're going to be a lot clearer than now thinking back. But I just love this series. It's so wholesome and there's so much great representation, both in terms of the main characters but also all of the side characters as well, and I just love that, and I love how the other characters' stories are like woven in. This one focuses quite heavily on eating disorders, so that's something to bear in mind before going into it if that's something that you might find difficult to read. But I thought the way that it was handled was really well done, and the look that it gave into the life of both the person who has the eating disorder and also the people surrounding them, and the way that it impacts everyone, I thought was really sensitively handled by Alice. And I will definitely be rereading all of the books again in time for the 5th one, which I can't believe is going to be the last one. I'm both so excited and also like not wanting it to happen because I don't want this series to end. I'm holding this one up because it's the most recent one, but just like all of them would make it onto the list of my favourites of the year. Moving on to the top 5, the next thing that I have here is After the Silence by Louise O'Neill. I think, again, I read this back in like March sort of time, and Louise O'Neill is another author who is definitely like one that I can picture as a future favourite, but I don't feel like I've read enough of her books at this point to say that. I've read this one and I've read Asking for It a long time ago, but I am going to be reading her debut for the I Should Have Read That book club in February. About this book specifically, I really loved this. This is set on an Irish island where 10 years ago a young girl was murdered, or at least found dead, and everyone assumes that it was murder, but the person who most people think did it on the island has been protected by their silence for all this time. No one was ever convicted of it. But now 10 years later, a documentary crew has gone back to the island to sort of bring up this case again and make a whole documentary about it, and it starts to uncover sort of the secrets of the past, and they begin to find out what really happened all those years ago. I won't say any more than that because it's one that I went into not really knowing too much, and I'm glad that I did, but I found the way that this was all resolved really satisfying, and the thing that I loved the most about it was those true crime vibes. I don't really listen or watch that much anymore, but I did go through a phase a few years ago where I was really into true crime, and I liked that I was able to get that sort of vibe from this. I also thought that this book did a good job of handling some other quite sensitive topics, and I can't wait to read whatever Louise O'Neill writes next. Next I have the book which I think I might have read like straight after finishing After the Silence, again very much of the same period of the year, and that was Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell. I loved this so much, and it's one of those books that I was really unsure about. I'd heard so much hype for it, but I just didn't think that it would necessarily be my thing, because prior to this I hadn't really read too much historical fiction for a start, and also I just don't really care about Shakespeare that much, which might be like a sin to say, especially because I did English at uni, but you know, I have enjoyed some of his plays, I've enjoyed seeing some of them, but I'm not like ever drawn towards reading Shakespeare. I have grown up quite near to Stratford upon Avon, so I have enjoyed going to see all the houses associated with him and learning about his history a little bit, but again, it's never been something that I've had like a real passion or interest in to go and learn about it a lot outside of that. But I decided to give in to the hype and pick this up, and I'm so glad that I did. It's honestly one of the most beautifully written things that I've ever read. I thought the storytelling in this was so beautiful, and some of the imagery was so like quiet but so powerful at the same time. It's just so clever, and it definitely did make me a lot more interested in the life of Shakespeare and his family. At the time when I was reading it, I was staying with my parents more long term. It was before I moved back to my flat, and I'm pretty sure that pretty soon after reading this I did convince them to go on a day trip to Stratford so that we could go and see the house and stuff again. We didn't go inside, but just saw a lot of the sites where this book would have taken place. So although this is a fictional story, it's sort of like Maggie O'Farrell imagining what could have possibly happened to Hamlet, who is Shakespeare's son. He had 3 children, but we don't really know that much about him. In fact, the only things that we know for sure about Hamlet are that he was born and that he died, and we don't really know anything else. But this sort of tells the story of his life and his death, and also the lives of the people surrounding him. Shakespeare is in this, but I would say that Agnes, his wife, is much more of a central character in this book, and I really liked reading about her and just seeing the way that the character in this book dealt with everything that she had to go through. Again, this is the only book by this author that I've read, but I would love to read more. I do know that a lot of her other work is quite different from this, I think, but I would love to give it a go anyway. If her writing style is anything like this, then I'm sure I will love it. On to the top 3. Actually, one of these is a fairly recent read, and that is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. Just have to show off this beautiful edition of it. I know everyone's seen it now, but I didn't read it in this edition. I actually was very kindly given this by my parents for Christmas, and I love it so much. It's so pretty. So I'm sure everyone probably knows about this book because everyone else in the world seemed to have read it before me. This is definitely another one that I probably would never have picked up if it hadn't been for a book club prompting me, and that was the I Should Have Read That book club, which I'm a co-host of, and we had the discussion of this on my channel, so I will leave a link to that in the description again if you want to hear me and Shannon and Charlotte talking about it more. But yeah, I loved it. It was so beautiful, so well done, and it's definitely made me want to learn a lot more about ancient Greece and Greek myths and all that sort of stuff, because I did it a little bit at primary school. I must have done, because I feel like everyone does. I also did do the Odyssey at uni, but I can't remember that. So my knowledge is like so limited. When I was talking to Shannon and Charlotte about it, they both like knew the outcomes of these characters already before going into it from just their knowledge, but I didn't have a clue. So I would love to read more. I did actually get a couple more like Greek myth retellings and Greek myth inspired stories for Christmas, but I would probably like to read more about the like origins of them before I then go in and read the more contemporary fiction. So if anyone has any recommendations, I think I'm going to get Greek Myths, the book by Jean Menzies, and have a look through that. But if anyone else has any recommendations for how they would go about learning more about this topic, then I would love to know. Yeah, this was just such a beautiful story, so well told. I don't really know what much else to say about it other than that. I would just recommend that everyone goes and reads it for themselves. Then I have Love After Love by Ingrid Persad. This I feel like I've hyped up so many times on this channel because it was number 1 on my list for a very, very long time. Again, would never have read this if it hadn't been for a book club. This was the first, I think, book for the Book Bar book club, and I decided to take part in that for a few months. This was the first one, and it just blew me away. Before reading this, I don't think I tried reading a book for the longest time, but this got me. This actually made me cry, so it's got to be on this list just for that alone. This is told in 3 perspectives: a mother and a son, and a man who becomes sort of like a found family member, and it's set in Trinidad, and it basically just follows all of their lives and the paths that these 3 different characters take, both together and apart, and it is so heartbreaking in places but so heartwarming in other places. And I don't want to say any more because again, it's one that I didn't know very much about when reading it, and I don't want to spoil the way that different characters go on their paths. There aren't really words, to be honest. I just loved it so much. I will leave some trigger warnings in the description because there are quite a few for this one. This, I believe, is the author's debut novel. I think she has some short stories out there, but I think this is her debut novel. But I just can't wait to read more of her novels in the future because I just think again that she is going to be another all-time favourite author for me. And the final book on this list, my favourite book of the year, doesn't even need an introduction because so many people love this book. And that is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I finally got around to reading this after all the hype that it has rightfully received. I think I read it in like August. It did take me quite a long time to get through because I was in a massive slump at the time. I think I read the first half of it like really slowly and then found some time and just sped through the second half and was like, I wish that I'd have just like flew through it all to begin with. So I definitely think it's worthy of a reread. My camera basically just gave up on me and I have to go out very soon, but I just wanted to really quickly wrap up this video by just saying that yeah, this book deserves all the hype. I'm so glad that I finally got round to picking it up in 2021. I have read Daisy Jones and really liked that, but I loved this one even more. And Evelyn and Celia are two characters that are going to stay with me for a very, very long time. I think this is definitely on the list of all-time favourite books, not just favourite books of the year. And I can't wait, but I'm also very scared to see how it's done when it's adapted. That's all I'm going to say about it. I don't feel like it really needs much else to be said because it's just so perfect. There are no words, again, no words for this one. So yeah, sorry that the end of this video was a little rushed and that I had to switch to my phone. And I feel like the more I loved the book, the fewer words I had to say about it, which is ironic. But those are my 10 favourite books of the year. If you've read any of these, I would love to hear your thoughts on them. If you have any recommendations based on the ones that I've loved, I would love to hear them, or just let me know what your favourite book of the year was. Other than that though, that is it for today's video. I hope you all have a very happy new year and I will hopefully see you soon in the new year with a new video. Bye!